everyone, this is Heather from weddingsbyheather.com, where my goal is to equip you with the best techniques and tips to make you a better and more efficient photographer. In this Q&A video, we are going to take a look at image file types, but first, make sure you check out my free workflow video series available on my website. This week's question comes from everyone because they are always asking me, should I shoot in RAW or JPEG? And what is the difference? I think the best thing to do is take a look at the differences between these two file types. RAW files are a proprietary format according to the camera manufacturer, where JPEG is a standard format. When you shoot in JPEG, the camera's internal software, known as the firmware, will take the information off of the sensor and quickly process it before saving it. As a result, some color is lost, as is some of the resolution. And on some cameras, there is slightly more noise in the JPEG than the RAW version. RAW files are uncompressed, whereas JPEG files are compressed. RAW files contain the complete lossless data from the camera's sensor, and depending upon your camera, you would be shooting in 12 or 14-bit. For JPEG, they're fairly small in size because they're compressed, and JPEG stores 8 bits of information per color for red, green, and blue. The difference of this is quite significant. An 8-bit file from a JPEG stores 256 individual shades of each of those primary colors, whereas a RAW file in 12 or 14-bit stores either 4,000 or up to 16,000 shades of information per color. So there is clearly a lot more data with those RAW files. RAW files are higher in dynamic range, where JPEG files are lower in dynamic range. For instance, when a JPEG photo is too bright or dark, there isn't much that can be done to save it because much of the data that was captured by the image sensor no longer exists. RAW files are not suitable for printing directly from the camera, whereas JPEG files are. RAW files require post-processing, and JPEG files do not require post-processing. And this is actually a big deal for some people. They like to just take their photos and immediately send them to the web or for print and not have to post-process them. So for those of you that simply want to cut to the chase and really don't care about all of this information, it boils down to this: RAW files require post-processing. So if you do not wish to sit in front of your computer and play around in Lightroom or Photoshop, which I love to do, then you would probably want to shoot in JPEG to make it easier for yourself. And all of this is great information, but we really have to take a look at this from a practical standpoint. So why don't we take a quick look at a few photos and see how this plays out. And just as an aside, all of this data was not enough for me. Early on in my career, I decided I needed more data. I'm an engineer by trade, so the information simply wasn't enough. I shot an entire wedding season, that's 30 weddings, in JPEG. The next year, I shot another entire wedding season, again 30 weddings, in RAW. I compared the 2 years overall and determined that for me in the wedding industry, it made more sense to shoot in RAW. Okay, so I took these photos of my kids in both JPEG and RAW. I'm going to take them into the develop module. I purposefully overexposed them so we could see the impact of dynamic range on photos. What I'm going to do is pull down the exposure of this photo to -1, and I'm going to do the same thing to this photo, about -1. And while we're here, why don't we just change the color ever so slightly just to see how that impacts the photo. I might also want to bring down the highlights and up on the shadows a little bit. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to this photo. Adjust the temperature and maybe the tint. It looks a little green. And then down on the highlights and up on the shadows. Okay, so I've basically done the same thing to both photos. And now let's compare them. This is the JPEG photo and this is the RAW photo. But let's take a closer look. I'm going to zoom in by pressing Command+, that's Control+ on the PC. And I'm looking at this photo and I'm looking at this photo. The first thing I'd like you to notice is his shirt. In the JPEG version, when we pulled down on the exposure, we lost a lot of data in his shirt, and you can see how it looks almost, I don't know, how would you describe that? Like plastic? It's just too saturated. The shadows and the highlights don't look natural, but if you look at his shirt in this photo, the raw version, it looks fantastic. I think the same thing is going to happen on these next two photos, so I'll just quickly pull this way down, and I will pull the raw version way down as well. And again, notice his shirt, look at their skin tone, and look at it here. That's with the color information from the camera. Obviously, I could adjust that, but remember, the JPEG file only has about 256 colors, whereas the raw file has upwards of 16,000 depending on your camera. So you have a lot more latitude in adjusting your white balance with the raw file than you do the JPEG. That being said, if you are an expert at getting your photo perfect as a JPEG out of your camera, then great. That works for you. Please continue to do so. This is largely a personal preference depending on your shooting style and your post-processing style. The best way to get a handle on this is to shoot in JPEG and RAW for a day or a session, and then compare the photos in Lightroom. Don't take my word for it. I encourage you to experiment with your own data. I hope that you found this useful. Please share this with your photographer friends, as I am certain they are curious as to whether or not they should shoot in JPEG or RAW. I'll see you in the next video.